Welcome to Casa Grande, one of the most spectacular sites that we'll find in the desert southwest today. We're walking around the site, located about halfway between Tucson and Phoenix, Arizona, in the Sonoran Desert. This particular site is attributed to what we archaeologists would call the Hohokam people. Now, no one today knows what the people called themselves or what they called this site. The culture that built it, the Hohokam, flourished from about 1,500 years ago to about 550 years ago. And archaeological sites like this at Casa Grande, we'll find similar patterns of pottery, decorative items, and lithics, and we'll find irrigation networks, ball courts, and pit houses placed around plazas, sometimes within walled compounds. So all of these share distinctive artifact patterns such as pottery, and so we will give this archaeological culture the name Hohokam. Now, archaeological cultures are defined by these patterns of artifacts and sites across space and time, and they may not match up exactly to the way ancient people saw themselves or divided themselves. The accepted term for the people who built these sites is the ancestral Sonoran Desert people. Now, 6 tribes today still have histories that link themselves back to the people who once lived here. For these tribes, Casa Grande is a very important place, and the term ancestral Sonoran Desert people is the proper term to refer to their ancient ancestors. Now, about 4,100 years ago, people in this area began to graze crops, particularly corn, and over time they added more crops to their repertoire, introduced by trade from different areas. They became more settled at this point, and they lived in the same place and for longer periods of time. They began to build what we call pit houses, semi-underground structures that were very suited to this environment. And they began to dig canals to water their crops, some of which were very thirsty crops like cotton, required a lot of water, so does corn for that matter. So the communities living along these canals then began to expand them as they expanded their fields, and as their fields became salted over or became infertile, they dig more canals and they go farther and farther. So at some point there were over 220 miles worth of canals within this region built by the prehistoric people. Now, larger villages began to appear about 1,500 years ago, and about 800 years ago they began to build these large above-ground structures and walled compounds, which were different than what they had been using up to that time. Now, these places were centers of long-range trade, and we believe that that was one aspect of these large above-ground compounds. We brought copper bells and scarlet macaws in from Mesoamerica, turquoise and obsidian from both the north and east as far as California. And people in this region also regularly traveled down to the Sea of Cortez in the Pacific, bringing seashells and resources from there. So we have beautiful materials fashioned from objects all over the Southwest. Now, they had almost over 19,000 acres of crops around here, irrigated, and the earliest canals, as I mentioned, started around 3,500 years ago. Now, the open spaces here at the site we just passed are called plazas, and people would be working out there in the winter. In the summer, they would be under ramadas or in the shades of these buildings. The structures themselves, the above-ground structures, were entered through the side doors or through the top, and they were used mostly for residents sleeping at night, especially during the winter time, and then for ceremonies, especially the buildings that had rooftop entries. Now, this large structure that we walked up to, Casa Grande itself, is quite mysterious. If you look closely, you can see there are horizontal lines in the walls. It's built out of caliche. It's not quite adobe. Instead of taking blocks, they would mix it like concrete and lay it down in layers and let it harden and then put another layer on. So it turned into material almost like concrete because it's mostly calcium carbonate. Now, we don't really know for sure what this structure and the other great houses, which we believe there were several in the region, were used for. But one clue as we walk around to this side is that there are several odd windows in the upper structure of this building that really don't have any other function except to let light in at a particular angle. What it turns out to be used for in that respect is an astronomical observatory. Now, these windows are precisely located and the building is located so you can watch the winter and summer solstices. You can predict the autumnal and spring equinox, and more interestingly, it will also record the 18.6-year cycle of the northernmost rising of the moon. Now this is extraordinary because this cycle is also observed in other places like the Hopewell sites in the central United States, and some have suggested that it's also part of the astronomical observations at Chaco Canyon. So Casa Grande, one of the largest buildings in the Southwest, mysterious uses, definitely for trade and for astronomical observation.